another Chinese-Filipino incident in the Spratly Islands, reduced Chinese aggression, and less bravado. Late in the week, the Chinese and Filipino Coast Guards had another clash in the South China Sea in the Spratly Islands. The Chinese were once again the aggressors as they continued to claim and defend their claims over the entire South China Sea in another clash with the Philippines. Despite the Chinese aggression that nearly mirrors the last incident in late October, this time the Chinese were unusually quiet about their claims and actions. The incident occurred on Friday, November 10, 2023, and was nearly identical to the scenario in October. The Chinese Coast Guard is maintaining a presence in the waters that the Filipinos and nearly the entire international community claim is Filipino territorial waters. The Philippines has grounded a naval ship, the Sierra Madre, in the 2nd Thomas Shoals in the Spratly Islands, and maintains a constant marine presence on the ship to support its claims in the waters. Just as the incidents in October, the Philippine Coast Guard and some supply ships were making a supply run to the Sierra Madre and was challenged by the Chinese Coast Guard. The Chinese in the previous incident rammed the Filipino Coast Guard and supply ships to prevent them from reaching the Sierra Madre. This time around, the Chinese response was somewhat less aggressive in that they used aggressive maneuvers to stop the Filipino flotilla, but did not try to ram the Filipino ships. It also used water cannons against the ships making the supply run to the Sierra Madre, but did not stop them from making their supply delivery. Why was the Chinese response less aggressive than October? Was it due to the aggressive protests of the Filipino government to the Chinese ambassador and the protests to the South Asian nations meeting that happened to be occurring in Beijing, or a warning of the U.S.-Filipino Defense Pact of 1951 that is still in force and requires the U.S. to defend the Philippines? The U.S. also followed up the incident with a freedom of navigation demonstration in the area by the U.S. Navy to remind the Chinese government of the U.S. position in October. All of these seem plausible, but not likely. The Chinese communist newspapers, such as the China Daily, the People's Daily, and the South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong-based newspaper, but it's not independent as it was in the past, have not put the incident in the newspaper or websites, as they did with the incident in October. These are mouthpieces of the CCP, so papers are being silent is part of state policy. But why? China's Xi Jinping is going to meet for the first time next week with U.S. President Joe Biden. So the most likely case is the Chinese government is trying to avoid any international incidents in the South China Sea to derail the Chinese goals of the summit with President Biden. The Chinese economy are facing headwinds in its debt, housing crisis, high youth unemployment, and falling external demand. There is concern in China that the world is proceeding with its decoupling from the Chinese economy and moving production out of the Chinese at its detriment. This decoupling process started under President Trump and sped up as the supply chain issues out of China during COVID and throughout China's zero COVID policy as international companies try to diversify from China. This is the detriment to the Chinese economy, and President Xi knows that President Biden will be a much more friendly partner than President Trump. So the Chinese do not want to miss an opportunity to focus on receiving favorable trade terms and address decoupling. Xi does not need an incident or coverage of an incident to disrupt his larger goals. The moderation of the Chinese in the South China Sea, both in the Coast Guard response and the muting of the diplomatic response by the PRC, should not be viewed as a changing in Chinese policy in the South China Sea. The change in the Chinese approach is all about China curating a narrative ahead of the Biden-Xi summit and to keep the focus on China's desired goals from this summit.